I'm here today for Jannike Allen's thesis presentation talk. She doesn't quite have her MS yet. Maybe I kind of jumped the gun. It's exciting to see that she's come so far. And it was interesting because Jannike was the first student I met who came to join my lab. And it was really interesting to meet Jannike and go through that dating process when you're trying to find a mentor in graduate school. The emails we sent each other, we had this interesting exchange over tea. I was just trying to figure out, do our interests overlap, do our personalities overlap? And I'm just really thankful that Jannike came to San Jose to join my lab. I'm also just really thankful for the diversity of things that she brought to the lab, not only to enrich my life, but to enrich everyone's life in the lab. So I asked people to share their thoughts about Jannike. Here's Jannike ready for field work. We were flying, also resting while flying a drone. This is just empty data. Right. One of the great things about Jannike is that her project is focusing on Chaparral. She works incredibly hard on quite a wide range of projects, and so she might be flying a drone for Ian's work here. I'm not sure. But it was a lot of collaborative experiences. And she also had a wonderful opportunity to go to Norway with Siri Rowan from the geology department to talk about climate adaptations, and had a great relationship built there that has continued here. And here's Jannike again, cool as a cucumber, but on the fire line. Jannike's personality. David Benetrout was another student in the lab. Also another PPE focused, safety first. Here we are getting ready again at our coastal berry project. She's also been a really great mentor to undergraduates in the lab. So Caitlin Lackey is one of the undergraduates who's learned quite a lot from Jannike, not only in style, but also through scientific mentorship. But seriously, look at the field stuff.
I did sew her that water bottle bag.
Yeah.
This is water bottle bag.
And the rapport in the lab has been really great. People hang out together in the lab and model, probably cuss or scratch their heads. I'm not sure. And drink tea. But you also engage with each other's hobbies. So I'm pretty sure this is probably your all's first hockey game. Jack, have you been to a hockey game?
That was the second one with them.
But the first time you'd ever seen hockey was with Jack. Yes. Yeah, you can tell the Jack still. Well, day to day, and help with modeling questions. And then Jannike's counterpart through all of this has been Ian. They both came on in my lab at the same time, although Jannike was the first one I was really interacting with. What's been really amazing to me was just their ability to come in as two separate students and work together to form a coherent team, both professionally and I think also in terms of friendship. I know you all have a big trip coming up to celebrate the end of an era for you all, but it's just been really great to see this atmosphere in the lab. So I just want to first just say thank you for all of your hard work, and I'm really excited for you to share that hard work. We might ask you a few hard questions. I'll ask Craig and Ashley at least ask you one or two hard questions each, just to prepare you for your future public meetings. But mostly this is a place to celebrate and share.
Thank you. Wow, how do I follow that? By figuring out how to move these slides off here. Is it back to looking good online too? Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. And today I'm going to just go over what I've been working on, re-examining the relationship between post-fire twig diameter and fire intensity in California's maritime chaparral in order to better assess fire severity. And chaparral is one of California's native ecosystems. You often see it on steep slopes, looking like a blanket of shrubs, and seeming to lack much vegetation diversity. But within that, it has a lot of value, and it can provide bird habitat as well as soil stabilization and protect water quality, serving as a buffer between rain and soil. It's home to many rare and special species, and it has a lot of aesthetic value too. But many people live in the chaparral, and since intense fire can happen in it, that can create some conflict.
You need to point it at your.
Point it at my machine, maybe? Okay. Yes, many people live near chaparral since it has such a wide distribution. And as I mentioned, intense fire can happen in it, which makes it a risky area for people to live. And with that conflict between people and fire, we need to learn more about managing chaparral. It typically burns as high severity crown fire, moving through those continuous shrubs. And the fire can actually stimulate seeds so that after the fire, you get a lot of herbaceous diversity, like these yellow flowers painting the hillside, and these other ones that have come up between these shrub skeletons. So we can see that over time, chaparral has a lot of diversity, just not when it's in shrub-only mode. And the shrubs can return after fire as well, either by resprouting from their bases or growing from seeds in the seed bank. Eventually, the shrubs generally fill in again as well. And you may be wondering why we want to focus on chaparral shrubs and why do we care about this, focusing on this ecosystem? Well, a couple things are going on. We're seeing increases in wildfires and also more interest in prescribed fire. And although chaparral is an ecosystem that experiences high severity crown fires, basic measurements to understand the severity are not well understood. One of the things that is going on is some type conversion from chaparral to grasslands. And in this picture, we see that the whole landscape was burned in 1970. The front areas were burned in 2001, and this bottom area burned again in 2003. And in this area, the shrubs aren't coming back. So that frequent fire is having a negative impact on ecosystem. But we don't know how widespread of an issue this is and if there's an over concern about type conversion. My research takes place in maritime chaparral, and a really solid clue that you're in the maritime version of chaparral is if you can see the ocean. Another way it differs from interior chaparral is that there's more water available. So that's from fog or deeper watering from rain. What actually happens when fire burns in chaparral? Well, if you can envision a campfire, you may know that small twigs burn first. And in chaparral fires, the fire can consume small twigs first, and in more intense fires, more and more of the shrub is consumed. So what you may have left in really intense fires may just be a stump at the base. And past researchers saw this relationship between the remaining twig diameter and the maximum temperature reached. And they saw that areas that burned cooler still had some small twigs, where areas that burned hotter generally just had large twigs left. And we expected that if we were to sample at areas that reached different maximum temperatures, we would also see this relationship. But when we did some initial sampling and analysis, it did not turn out that way. We did not have a stair step of larger twig diameters with increasing maximum temperature reached. So we decided to dive into this relationship further. course, we went into this with a lot of different questions. For one, what methods are people using to assess fire severity via twig diameter in Chaparral? We also wanted to know what is the most accurate method for measuring twig diameter to assess fire severity. And we're also looking to make recommendations for future research and management. So my study site is part of the California Canyon Fire Experiment near Salinas, California. It's made up of maritime chaparral vegetation, and it also has some oak woodland plant communities. This is drone imagery of the site, and in yellow we have my sampling plots, and there's some ground stations in red, which I'll talk about later. The burn unit is in black. But the main characters of my research are black sage and chamise, and both of these shrub species have the ability to resprout after fire. We also had some shrubs that were likely one of those two species, but we weren't able to identify them, so we classified them as unknown. And those were generally ones that hadn't resprouted and were burned down, so there wasn't very much of it left. So a little bit more about the California Canyon Fire Experiment. It's been a collaboration between many researchers, and it was implemented by San Jose State University's Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center and Cal Fire. And so people have been looking at this fire from a lot of different angles, and we focused on some ecology questions there. The fire itself happened in October 2022, and this was an unusual prescribed fire. It was done specifically for research, and it was done when the fire would burn in summer burn conditions, close to how a wildfire would burn. So we can take a look at this video of the ignition. The fire was ignited off to the side of the bottom of the canyon and allowed to run up it as head fire. There was a lot of preparation done to burn areas around that main canyon in order to create a catcher's mitt for containment. How did we actually study this site? One of the first things we looked at was fire intensity, which is the energy output of the fire, and our measurement for this is temperature. Ground stations were used to measure temperature, and also remote sensing to capture thermal imagery was done from a helicopter. We also assessed the fire effects, which encompasses how the fire's intensity impacts the plants. So chaparral burns at high intensity, but within that we see variation in the amounts of twigs that are consumed and the heat that's produced. So we went out and we measured twigs on some burned shrubs using digital calipers, rulers, and a Trimble R1 GNSS unit in order to record the location of our sampling plots. And to take another look at how we measured fire intensity, this is what one of the ground stations looked like with thermocouples to measure temperature. And this is what the helicopter looked like with the SJSU wildfire imaging system on it to capture thermal imagery, where temperatures were filtered to include temperatures over 250 degrees Celsius. The helicopter was in a fixed position, looking at the canyon from an oblique angle, so it had this view, and it captured the 12 minutes that the fire erupted up the canyon and the main part of the fire while it was running up there. The camera captured 30 frames per second. And that remote sensed thermal data gave me several pieces of information. The first of which was the maximum temperature reached. And with that, I was able to spread my sampling sites across 6 different temperature bins to kind of capture that distribution of maximum temperatures reached. And the time series temperature data told me some more information beyond just that max temp. It also let me look at how long each plot was heated. So these are a few example plots. And on my x-axis, I have time from about 1:10 p.m. to 1:25 p.m. And on the y-axis, I have temperature ranging from 250 to 740 degrees Celsius. And we can see that some of these were heated for longer, but at lower temperatures, and some of these were heated to higher temperatures, but for shorter amounts of time. And with this data, I was able to count up how much time each plot spent over different temperature thresholds. And you can think about when you're baking a pizza, and I'm sure all of you know that depending on how long you leave the pizza in the oven and how hot the oven is, your pizza is going to turn out differently. So similarly in Chaparral, we think that heating it for different amounts of time and at different temperatures will likely have different effects. And in order to look at some of those effects, we tried to emulate a variety of methods that researchers have used to look at how twig diameter relates to fire intensity. And we were trying to understand which methods are actually needed in order to see that relationship, again, between twig diameter and fire intensity, which was necessary because that first analysis didn't show a strong relationship. So I'm just going to give you a brief glimpse into some of the research that's been going on. So some people have been measuring fire intensity and also measuring twig diameter, but they vary in how they pick which twigs to measure and where on the twig they take the measurement. Other folks have been using twig measurements in order to say something about fire intensity as a proxy for fire intensity. And this is often at sites where it wasn't possible to measure fire intensity, such as during a wildfire, when people weren't planning to monitor that. But these methods vary as well. And so they vary in how the twigs were selected and where on the twig they were measured, and also how many measurements were taken per shrub. And so with all these differences in mind, we compiled 6 different methods to compare. And again, they vary in ways that we saw in the published literature. So to break these down, our methods include some where we selected the smallest twigs we could find, and others where we prioritized measuring the outer twigs. So, for example, with this being a stem from one of the shrubs, if I was sampling for the smallest twigs, I might prioritize measuring that one. And if I was prioritizing the outer twigs, I would start here. Another way that our methods vary is in the sampling effort. So that's how many measurements are taken per shrub. And our methods 1 and 2 had up to 10 twigs measured per shrub. Our methods 3 and 4, which we call thorough, had up to 50 measurements per shrub. And methods 5 and 6, which we call haphazard, had up to 4 measurements per shrub. And these methods also vary in their measurement location. So here, all of the twigs that are indicated in blue indicate that the method involves measuring 1 centimeter from the tip. And the methods where twigs are indicated in red mean that we measured at the tip. So if I was measuring 1 centimeter from the tip, I would take a measurement like that. And if I was measuring at the tip, it would be up there. Another thing that varied was the tool that we used to measure the twigs. So when we first started out in fall 2023, we just used rulers. But when we added methods 2 through 6 in spring 2024, we switched to digital calipers. And in fall 2023, there had just been one rainy season since the fire, but in spring 2024, there had been 2 rainy seasons since the fire. So we had a bunch of different hypotheses about how to compare these methods. We thought that the sampling methods would vary in how well they correlate with fire intensity. Measuring 1 centimeter from the tip might be better than measuring at the tip. We thought thorough measurements of the outer twigs might be the best, but that a lower sampling effort with the haphazard selection may also be adequate. But how did we actually assess which sampling methods correlate with fire intensity? We modeled twig diameter in R. So with each method's data set of twig diameter measurements, I used generalized linear mixed effects models, also called LIMER models. And in the blue box here is my fixed effect fire intensity, and that's a key part of predicting the response variable twig diameter. And fire intensity in each model varied, but it was either the maximum fire temperature reached, or it was the duration of heating, so the time that each plot was over a temperature threshold. And for those models that use duration of heating to represent fire intensity, I performed AIC competitions to determine which temperature threshold would make the best model. And AIC values tell us which model can predict future data best. And the thresholds that I used ranged from 250 to 600 degrees Celsius. And yes, loops were involved. And that allowed me to refine my models down to just 12, using the thresholds that were best for each twig sampling method. And for most of these, the best threshold was 250 degrees Celsius, although for twig sampling method 1, it was 300 degrees Celsius. But I'll just point out, these are all at the low end of my threshold options. None were up near 600. Random effects were also included in each model, and those included shrub species, also the base area of the shrub, in order to provide information about the shrub's age pre-fire, and whether the twig was measured on the same stem, the same shrub, or on the same plot. Although some models didn't include all of these things. For example, if we didn't measure the shrub base, we didn't include that in the model. So it's not included in our method 1 models. And we also didn't have this stem nesting on all of them, because if there was generally just one twig per stem, we weren't associating multiple twigs with each other. All right, next we get to look at the results. So for all of our methods, the species were statistically different, but they didn't vary much in magnitude, especially black sage and chamise. They were typically within a few millimeters of each other. The unknown species were larger, which makes sense because, again, those tended to be the ones that had burned the most and were hardest to identify. To compare the 12 different models, I looked at AIC values, which, again, they represent how well each model could predict future data. And when comparing them, lower values are better. And for models that used the same twig sampling method, the one that used duration of heating for that fire intensity value performed a little bit better than maximum temperature for all of them. You can see that black peeking out below. But the overall best AIC was with the model that used duration over 300 degrees Celsius to predict twig diameter, with twig sampling method 1. And this did contrast with our prediction, since during that preliminary analysis, it didn't seem like measuring at the tip would be descriptive enough. This model did have one less random effect than all of the others, but I tried removing that from another model and saw that it didn't seem to impact AICs very much. So let's look a little deeper into this kind of winning model and the data that goes with it. Here on my x-axis, I have time over 300 degrees Celsius, ranging from 0 to 660 seconds. And on the y-axis, I have twig diameter ranging from 0 to 50 millimeters. The raw data shown here has black sage indicated in green, chamise in purple, and unknown in gray. And our model's predictions are shown here as lines with 95% confidence intervals as ribbons. We see that the unknown species are modeled as larger than black sage, and that's slightly larger than chamise. So I mentioned before that this one had the lowest AIC, which again told us that the model would predict future data best. But we also considered the R-squared values, which help us assess how well the model describes the observed data. And these R-squared values show us that species and duration of heating explain 16% of the twig diameter variation we saw. And when we also include the random effects, 61% of the variation was explained. Let's look again at what method 1 actually was. It involves selecting the smallest twig on each stem and measuring at the tip. And again, this really contrasted with our prediction, where we hadn't thought that measuring at the tip would be descriptive enough. But method 1 data was collected 1 year after the burn, having just experienced one rainy season. And since burned shrubs can become weathered, sampling close to when the fire happened may have been a big part of what helped this data perform well. But because our research just represents one site with a couple of species, we feel that it's worth looking at some other sampling methods that are promising as well. And our next lowest AICs are twig sampling methods 5 and 6. As a reminder, these both involved haphazardly selecting 4 twigs per shrub. And for method 5, we measured at the tip. And for method 6, we measured 1 centimeter from the tip. And with just 4 measurements per shrub, this is not a very difficult sampling effort. So it's pretty attractive in that sense as well. And again, we looked at the AIC values and R-squared values. So the AIC values are telling us how well the model could predict future data, and the R-squared values are telling us how well the model described the observed data. And although method 1 has a slightly lower AIC of the two, it had very poor R-squared values, so it did not seem to describe the observed data well. And it doesn't necessarily feel right to recommend a method that doesn't describe the observed data well. But for method 6, the R-squared values are much higher, and they indicate that species and duration of heating explained 32% of the variation in twig diameter. And when we also include random effects, 73% of the variation was explained. We can take a look at the data and models for each of these. So for method 5, we see the model with time over 250 degrees Celsius, and the unknown species are larger than black sage, which are larger than chamise. For method 6, it's pretty similar, but everything's shifted a little bit larger, which makes sense because when you're measuring 1 centimeter from the tip, you're measuring a larger part of the shrub than at the tip. And just to kind of drill this in, method 1 was sampled just after one rainy season after the fire, while methods 2 through 6 were sampled after there'd been 2 rainy seasons post-fire. So there was more opportunity for weathering by the time we went out and measured these. And the twig tips may have become damaged. So perhaps measuring at the tip is only the best if you're able to do it soon after the fire. All right, to summarize the main results, in our models, duration of heating at 250 degrees Celsius or 300 degrees Celsius is a better representation of fire intensity than maximum temperature reached. For duration of heating, the twig diameter is influenced most by how long the shrubs burn at lower temperatures rather than time at higher temperatures. Remember those loops that selected low thresholds for every sampling method? And we saw that the best model for predicting future twig diameters was method 1, where the smallest twigs were measured at the tip, modeled with duration over 300 degrees Celsius. The haphazard twig sampling, so methods 5 and 6, may also represent fire intensity well, and models using methods 2, 3, and 4 do not predict future twig diameters well. Of course, there were numerous limitations. So in the field, it was not possible to exactly replicate published methods, especially given the limited level of detail in some of those publications. We also relied on the remote sense data, but it was only captured for a limited portion of the fire. So especially for plots that were higher up the canyon, they may have been heated for longer than was captured by the helicopter. Our thermal data also has, at best, 4-meter resolution. And we, unfortunately, did not have enough thermocouples for widespread analysis using temperature measured on the ground. We didn't sample all of the methods at the same amount of time after fire. And we had some bias against recording shrubs that burned to the ground because they were harder to find. We also had limited access to the areas that burned the hottest because they were very steep. And then while modeling, we had a variety of limitations as well, including that some of the models had less variables. But although that could make the AIC values less comparable, I did try removing shrub base and comparing to see how that impacted some models, and R-squared values and AIC values still seem to be in the same ballpark. We did not collect pre-fire plant data on the ground in the areas that the helicopter recorded, so we couldn't include any of that in our modeling. And a big one is that this just represents one site with one gradient of fire intensities. So there's definitely a lot of room for further research in this area. And we feel that it was important to take this time to validate the relationship between twig diameter measurements and fire intensity, and that it would be good to standardize how we measure shrubland fire severity with twig diameter measurements as a community. And with that in mind, we recommend our method 1, especially for those who are able to sample soon after fire. Some of the methods of post-fire twig measurements don't reflect differences in fire intensity across our site very well, at least when it comes to modeling future data. And looking more specifically at methods 3 and 4, although they wouldn't seem to predict future data well, they did have high R-squared values. So if folks are doing very thorough sampling, they may be describing their observed data well as well. And I know we've been over this a few times, but the sample timing may influence what measurement location it makes sense to use as land managers or researchers. So if a lot of weathering has occurred, it might be better to measure 1 centimeter from the tip. And looking forward, sampling twig diameters can help researchers and land managers assess burn severity by comparing within sites. For example, land managers may use twig sampling as part of assessing if they've reached their prescribed fire burn objectives. And taking the time to refine and validate sampling methods can help other people effectively monitor their burn chaparral sites and help them evaluate how fires of different intensities are affecting ecological factors like shrub regeneration and botanical diversity. And we think that researchers should expand the gradient of where these methods are assessed across maritime chaparral and chaparral as a whole, and that they should continue comparing, measuring at the tip versus 1 centimeter from the tip. These are my references, and I'd like to give a big thanks to all the funders that have supported this work, and really a big thanks to all of the co-authors, field assistants, people that helped with figures, and also thanks to the branch that allowed us access and all of our collaborators. And with that, I'll take questions.
So Jannike, I'm curious, if you're talking to a land manager who's going to do a prescribed fire, what would you recommend for a prescribed fire goal for twig diameters if they're doing a chaparral burn for ecological versus fuel reduction goals?
I think that most chaparral has evolved to have high severity fires. So to burn in that way and have the twig diameters be really large afterwards would be a sign of supporting ecological goals. Although it's worth considering, and I know a lot of chaparral land managers have concerns about doing prescribed fire if there's a chance of a wildfire coming in soon after, if the vegetation there relies on having an adequate seed bank to come back. So definitely keeping in mind which species are present and making decisions based on that. And I guess for fuel reduction, if you can burn it hot, that probably would give you the most fuel reduction in the near term. So also looking for large twigs. Although I think that more research is needed in what intensities we should be aiming for in prescribed fires. And that's part of what this tool of being able to assess just by measuring twig diameters could help inform. Yeah.
Hey, can you talk about the relationship between fire intensity and fire severity, especially with this specific fire regime?
Yeah, so generally the intensity is focusing on the energy output of the fire, but the severity can encompass more of the ecosystem impacts from the fire. So in other ecosystems, the severity might be more apparent right away with how much mortality has occurred. But since it's typical for there to at least be top kill in this ecosystem, it's worth also looking at more ecosystem responses and looking over time to see what's able to come back. Was there another part of your question?
No, that's, yeah, just clarify. I feel like good to, I think people can misconstrue and save,
Definitely.
So just wanted to make sure. And then what do you think? So, I mean, this is a little bit out of your talk, but thinking about remote sensing of severity, and this is an awesome case study where you have that, helicopter able to collect that data. But how do you think we can maybe use remotely sensed data to kind of combine with some of these on the ground methods?
Some other folks working at this site have been analyzing the biomass changes. So I think that certainly there's a space to do that with remote sensing, especially if you know that fire is going to occur and you can collect it beforehand. Because that was with drone imagery. So I'm not sure how viable more widespread remote sensed imagery is for that. But I think it's a tough one. You can get some information from the biomass change, but in this ecosystem, since top kill doesn't necessarily mean that that plant is dead, it's not going to capture the full picture.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, this was great. I really enjoyed the presentation. I learned a lot. And I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
I'll focus on a couple things that I think are relative to the question just asked. When you talk about fire intensity, did you come across firearms fire line intensity, and like what units? So is it just temperature? Is your relative for?
Yeah, we're just using temperature.
And so thinking about, I was surprised that you didn't, in your analysis, there's one site, I think it was 22, that was in the hottest part of the fire, 650 and above, and I was surprised that the highest temperatures that were measured were in the 700s, 700 C. Is that typical for Chaparral?
I think that we're kind of thinking of this fire as being like a lower intensity wildfire, potentially, but so many wildfires are not monitored in the same way. So I'm not sure what all of those are, what temperatures those are burning at. And I think I've been kind of cautioned against comparing temperatures measured from different sources, like on the ground versus from the helicopter. So I think that the information we got from the helicopter is really good relative to each other. But I understand that there is some, potential for things to affect it, like the atmosphere. And I think that the question of like, where was that temperature at the top of the burning shrub? That's a little bit outside of my expertise, but I would, for my purposes, I'm looking at it mostly relative to each other.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and that's something that we don't usually think of when we're looking at this airborne data. And where's the timing of that high intensity? One question I had, probably is in the thesis itself, but wasn't clear your time series of temperature figures. That was from the in situ field site. Was that the thermocouple data?
No, that was from the helicopter.
Oh, so that was a pixel that you looked at the timing of how hot that pixel was for a certain time.
Yeah, so Andrew Clopus helped with some Python code to extract it for all of my plots.
That's fantastic, because usually we can get that. It's hard to get that from helicopter data. So that was the question: is that the residence time, to get residence times of these fires?
Yeah, I think that was a really exciting piece of data to be able to get from that thermal imagery. And, we certainly saw that being able to have information about the duration of heating was really key to getting at this relationship. And so there was a lot of data. There was 30 frames per second. So I cut it back to 1 per second.
Yeah. Oh, you don't like that mission. That's fantastic. Okay, I've got one more question as committee member. I've got 10, but I'm only going to have one. And this is something, I'm not a fire ecologist. Was there variation in the consumption across the canyon after post-fire? Did you see that, or is that something that can be described from these data?
I mean, like I was mentioning that others like Shangyu have been looking at biomass change. I think that kind of gets at more of what you're asking with consumption. I think that you could relate these twig measurements to consumption because larger twigs are what you're measuring if more of the shrub was consumed. But it's not perhaps as direct. So I haven't looked into the kind of spatial distribution of what these measurements could mean for consumption. But I do think that there's room for more to be done with this data, like maybe looking at how it could give us ideas about consumption. And also, we did record whether each shrub had resprouted or not. So having a way to look at regeneration, other people could crunch the data some more. Yeah.
You just about consumption.
All right, that's right.
Or the next step is for Jannike to take this data. She can bring in that data.
Well, that answered another question of mine. Is there a need to continue studying the site? Do you believe these data are going to be useful for future studies? I mean, we only had this one case. It's hard to burn a head fire in a canyon. So getting this opportunity again as a high intensity fire may not come in the next decade. I mean, it may be very challenging to get these types of data. My final question for you, and I'll let it open up to the non-committee members, is: was this fire good or bad for the ecosystem? Because it was set as a head fire in Chaparral, and as a non-fire ecologist, might have received some grief about doing that because we were trying to study explosive fire behavior, and that is something that's really hard to observe. And so, what results do you think?
I don't think you need to feel bad about it. I feel like this site has sidestepped some of the controversy because the black sage and chamise resprout. So if these were obligate seeders that relied on having replenished the seed bank to come back after fire, then, there's more controversy around doing a prescribed fire that could then be close in time to an unplanned fire, and then you could start to convert the site to grasslands. But because these are able to resprout, they're not as vulnerable to that. And, we didn't really get the chance to look at the botanical diversity in depth. That was kind of the first idea for doing fire ecology research out there, but we realized we really needed to figure out these twig methods before potentially going that route. But there was definitely a lot of herbaceous diversity coming up those first 2 springs after. And this ecosystem evolved to burn at high intensity. So I'm sure, further investigation would be good, but it doesn't seem like it was bad ecologically.
Great. Thank you.
I saw Ian.
Got my training on that. So often I think about how cool it is that you're able to do this research and draw conclusions about fire severity and fire behavior without any kind of control, any kind of data. And it's neat to work in prescribed fire because I think it's one of the few areas of fire that affords us the ability to potentially have some of that pre-treatment data. It certainly helps me a lot of my own stuff. If you were to do similar research like this, investigate the same questions, but this time you had the ability to take some pre-fire data, would you be most interested in getting? How would you be interested in, further building out what you're doing?
I think, every time we went out there, we thought it might be the last time we went. And so it didn't seem pertinent to tag any of the shrubs, but that certainly could be worthwhile to tag some shrubs beforehand, and especially in the steep areas, because I mentioned there was some bias against the ones that burned all the way to the ground, because especially with those loose soils, they could get covered up. And I think we would need a really good GPS type unit paired with actually tagging some shrubs to be able to return to the same spots. But especially if you started looking at how the fire intensities are impacting things like regeneration, I think, you know, the data we have is good, but we're still biasing against shrubs that may have just been kind of lost underground because they were consumed so fully and didn't resprout. Henry?
This question is from Zoom, David Ventura.
Okay, thank you.
Do you think the true explanatory variable would be some combination of duration and max temp, or do you feel strongly about your finding for this situation? And I expect it's hard to model both of those terms simultaneously.
Oh, yes, David. Yeah, we did start thinking about putting them both in, but it was difficult to get these models to converge with everything we were putting in, and so we opted to leave them separate. I think that, you know, for certain fire effects that maybe we don't understand yet, the maximum temperature could be an important component. And also, if there was a way to like include more of those duration thresholds to get at like how long it was over higher temperatures, that might provide a fuller picture. But I don't know. I'm not a modeling expert, so I think it would be difficult.
I think you might be a modeling expert now after all.
I'm something. I don't know. Any other?
Awesome. Another question.
Mhm.
Am I cutting you off? I hope not.
Okay.
So this is one burn in one location with 12 minutes of temperature data. If you were to be able to set up kind of a bigger experiment, I guess what scope can we really, you know, who do you suggest? All shrubland across this region, or are there specific areas that you think this method would be best? And then maybe what are some I don't know, other variables that you'd like to consider or kind of see varied if you were to plan a California-wide experiment?
I think there's a couple ways this could kind of get scaled up. Certainly, if you don't try to measure fire intensity, you're just kind of applying twig measurements as a proxy for fire intensity, then going out and sampling in sites with similar vegetation. I mean, chamise is great because it's so widespread in Chaparral. And since we found black sage to be so similarly sized, it kind of speaks to that this could be used on several different species. So I think, you know, if sampling was done across a gradient in California, it would be great to measure both at the tip and 1 centimeter from the tip, just to compare further if one of those measurement locations is more consistently useful in different sites. And I think the real, like where it really starts to get interesting is when you're using these twig sampling methods to get at other questions about the ecological impacts. And so it would be cool to compare at sites with prescribed fire and wildfire and see like what twig measurements you're getting and what botanical diversity is coming up after, those sorts of things.
So my question is kind of getting back down into the weeds of your methodology a little bit, and then I'm hoping to try to kind of get to the similar question that's larger scale. But so you measured preliminary data to look at the published method, to look at diameter, size, and intensity, and your preliminary data didn't show the relationship that you expected based on literature. Was those preliminary measurements from the canyon burn, or was that from a completely different?
It was at the canyon burn.
Was it that
It
first
was-
spring sampling?
Yeah, it was our method 1.
That was my question.
Yeah.
Was that method 1?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me now that you've come back to method 1. And so I guess I'm just a little bit, are you going back to the similar method that was published? Or is how is it different? And is it not showing that diameter relationship? Or
Well, when we started sampling, we were looking at Moreno and Ocho's method, but we kind of scaled back on how many measurements per shrub, so it would be more feasible. And yeah, we were measuring with a ruler. We're just kind of mostly it was Henry and David getting the data because a lot was going on. And I did try to analyze it in a similar way to Moreno and Ocho, where they were averaging a lot of their data. And they also had the temperatures in bins because their maximum temperature was based on temperature pellets that react when the fire reaches certain temperatures. So they were able to have more fine spatial scale, but their fire didn't seem to get as hot as ours, and their temperature was binned. Yeah, it was, maybe glimmers weren't available to them. So, yeah, it is interesting that we're back to method 1. Yeah. Yeah. Kind of, yeah. Was there another part of it?
So kind of getting back to your last question point. So you wanted this to, be done and applied to a lot of ecosystems across California, and you think that, and I don't have a good understanding of like these sage distributions. You think your method, it looks like because they weren't that different between the species, it would probably apply in different, ecosystems that are the same species but maybe have different distributions of species. I guess the question is just how well would it apply as the Chaparral systems vary compared to the one sighting?
Yeah, so chamise is in a lot of Chaparral. So that's promising to use elsewhere. It does seem like from some correspondence I've had that certain species might not be appropriate to compare, but I think that something to keep in mind is you can compare within a site, but we're not at a point where you can measure a twig and look at a graph and come up with what the fire's intensity was based on that. You can see relative fire intensity within a site. So I think it's certainly applicable in many areas. It's been used in a lot of different chaparral, just without very consistent methods. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I find it fascinating that just the twig diameter post-fire, you can correlate intensity without knowing what it was beforehand, which is, I guess, the biomass. So what were their underlying assumptions on how much was burned, and it's just the twig diameter itself was some sort of, were there some underlying assumptions behind post-fire twig diameters, meaning the shrub burned so much?
I mean, I think that I'm assuming that the shrubs of the same species kind of started out with similar twig sizes. we did measure the base of the shrub to get some idea, some information that relates to the age of the shrub beforehand, because if it has a bigger base, it seems like it's older. And that went into the models that we measured it for those methods. But yeah, I sometimes get to hike in unburned chaparral and take in the unburned chamise, and wow, look at those tiny twigs on there. I think, of course, there's some variation, but they probably are similar when they're in the same species. And with the black sage, you know, it's another species, but when they were burned, they were very close. Chamise to black sage in size. Yeah.
I have one harder question. So a number of really prominent fire ecologists measured 1 centimeter in or beyond the carboniferous tip. If you were having a dinner conversation with them about where to measure, how would you kind of bring that up in a discussion, and what do you think you might tell them about your results?
I think I might have to assure them that I don't think their work is bad, as especially those thorough measurements. It does still seem like whether you're at the tip or 1 centimeter from the tip, it does seem to describe observed data well. The differences come more when we're modeling for future data. And I think it's very interesting that we have to be wary of that carboniferous tip. So, I mean, if I was having dinner with Moreno, I would have to say thanks for that diagram. And probably try to get their insights on timing for the measurements. Because, I mean, that's another area that more research could be done. Like, especially if you tag shrubs, keep going to the same ones and see how much the measurements change over time. Yeah.
Well, you talked about pizza in your talk, which maybe made people start to get hungry right before dinner. Me too.
Just kidding.
Here. So, Jannike, we thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and all of your hard work and camaraderie. And I'd love for us to go hang out and chat a little bit more so you can continue asking your questions. But for dinner.
Sounds good.
Thank you.